I knew something was off the second I saw the notice taped to my front door. The HOA never missed a chance to nickel and dime us, but this was a whole new level. Effective immediately, HOA fees will increase by 20% to cover rising community costs. 20%, just like that. No warning, no meeting, no breakdown of expenses, just a demand. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and a woman who thrived on making everyone else miserable. She strutted around like she owned the place, nitpicking landscaping, measuring grass heights, and issuing fines for the most ridiculous things. Last month, she sent a violation notice to my neighbor for leaving her trash bins out 10 minutes past pickup time. I crumpled the notice in my fist. Community costs, my foot. This was Margaret's way of squeezing more money out of us for whatever pet project she had in mind. A new fountain for the clubhouse, more decorative street signs. Or perhaps another catered HOA meeting where she and her lackeys feasted on expensive hors d'oeuvres while the rest of us were told to tighten our belts. Not this time. I marched straight to her house, past the perfectly trimmed hedges that she probably measured with a ruler. Her front door opened before I even knocked. "Olivia," Margaret greeted, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I assume you're here about the fee adjustment." "Fee adjustment, try daylight robbery." Her eyes narrowed. "The board voted on it. Rising maintenance costs require—" "Spare me the speech, Margaret. Where's the financial breakdown? What exactly are these rising costs?" She folded her arms. "That information is only available to board members." I let out a dry laugh. "So you expect us to just hand over more money without any transparency?" "The decision is final," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "If you can't afford it, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you." Oh, that did it. I wasn't just going to fight this, I was going to expose whatever shady business she was running. I left Margaret's doorstep with my jaw set and my mind racing. If she thought she could strong-arm the entire neighborhood into paying more without justification, she was in for a rude awakening. The problem was, I needed proof, concrete evidence that she and her little HOA cronies were mismanaging funds or worse, embezzling. I started with the HOA's financial reports. Legally, homeowners had the right to review them, but getting my hands on them wasn't going to be easy. Margaret ran the HOA like a dictatorship, and I doubted she'd willingly hand over documents that could expose her. That's where my friend Jake came in. Jake was a forensic accountant, the kind of guy who could sniff out financial discrepancies like a bloodhound. I called him up, explained the situation, and by the next day we were sitting in my living room, surrounded by every report, budget summary, and expenditure list I could legally obtain. Jake's brow furrowed as he flipped through the papers. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, pointing to a line item for community landscaping improvements. According to the report, the HOA had spent nearly $50,000 over the past year on landscaping alone, yet the only noticeable change in the neighborhood was the addition of a few overpriced flower beds near the clubhouse. "Where's the rest of the money going?" I asked. Jake tapped a number on the page. "That's the question. Either they're grossly overpaying for services or someone's skimming off the top." I wasn't surprised, but I needed more than a hunch. I needed irrefutable proof. So I did what any determined homeowner would. I dug deeper. I started by tracking down the vendors listed in the financial reports. Most were legitimate companies, but one stood out: Greenway Estates Landscaping. A quick search revealed that the company didn't exist, at least not in any official capacity. No website, no business registration, nothing. I shared my findings with Jake, and he leaned back, arms crossed. A fake vendor. Classic embezzlement move. Someone's funneling HOA money into a non-existent business and pocketing the cash. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Margaret had been fleecing us for who knew how long, but now I had something tangible. The question was, what was the best way to use it? I considered going to the HOA board, but Margaret had them wrapped around her finger. Reporting it to the police could work, but without absolute proof of where the money was going, they might not act quickly. Then it hit me. If Margaret was committing fraud, she wasn't just violating HOA rules, she was likely breaking federal tax laws. And there was one organization that didn't take kindly to financial crimes, the Internal Revenue Service. Jake grinned when I suggested it. If she's been siphoning money, there's no way she's reporting it properly. An IRS audit would tear through her finances like a buzzsaw. It was time to set things in motion. I gathered every suspicious financial document, compiled a report detailing the shady transactions, and filed an anonymous tip with the IRS. Now, all I had to do was wait. It didn't take long for the storm to roll in. 2 weeks after I sent in the IRS report, the first cracks in Margaret's empire started to show. I noticed it when I passed by the HOA clubhouse one evening and saw an unfamiliar black SUV parked out front. The doors bore no logos, but the 2 men in crisp suits walking inside weren't from around here. By midweek, whispers were spreading like wildfire. Margaret had been seen arguing with someone outside her house, her usually smug demeanor replaced with something closer to panic. HOA meetings, which were typically held with unnecessary pomp and self-importance, were suddenly postponed without explanation. Something was brewing, and I had a good idea of what it was. Then came the fireworks. Late Friday afternoon, I was on my way back from the grocery store when I spotted Margaret standing on her porch, confronting 2 men in dark suits. Unlike her usual confrontations, this one lacked her trademark arrogance. Her arms were crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. One of the men, holding a thick folder, gestured toward a document, his expression unreadable. I didn't need to hear what they were saying to know exactly what was happening. The IRS had come knocking. Margaret's pristine, carefully maintained world was beginning to crumble. By the following Monday, the HOA's official email account sent out a short, formal statement. Due to unforeseen administrative irregularities, the HOA board will be undergoing a routine financial audit. We appreciate your patience during this time. Routine, please. As the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood became almost tangible. Margaret, who once patrolled the streets like a self-appointed monarch, had all but disappeared. The HOA board members, previously eager to enforce every petty rule, suddenly had little to say. It was clear that something serious was unfolding behind closed doors. Then, the real bombshell dropped. A local news outlet got wind of the investigation. It started as a small blurb on their website, something easily missed until they dug deeper. Soon, a full-blown report surfaced, detailing potential financial misconduct within the HOA. The article didn't name names, but anyone living in our neighborhood knew exactly who was responsible. The next HOA meeting, which had been delayed for weeks, was now unavoidable. The entire neighborhood was buzzing. People who had never bothered to attend before were suddenly eager to see the spectacle unfold. The meeting hall was packed, standing room only. Margaret sat at the front, noticeably paler than usual. The rest of the board members flanked her, their expressions ranging from nervous to outright miserable. The HOA's so-called treasurer, a man named Greg who had always been just another one of Margaret's lackeys, cleared his throat and attempted to maintain some semblance of control. Due to recent allegations, he started, his voice wavering, we are cooperating with the relevant authorities to ensure full transparency. The crowd wasn't buying it. Someone from the back scoffed loudly. Another voice called out, demanding to know exactly where their money had gone. Margaret finally spoke. Gone was the commanding tone she usually used when dictating house colors and mailbox styles. Instead, she sounded defensive, desperate even. There have been misunderstandings, she insisted. The board has always acted in the best interest of the community. The room erupted. People shouted over one another, demanding accountability. Someone held up a printout of the news article, waving it for emphasis. The HOA had ruled with an iron fist for years, but now the residents weren't afraid anymore. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Where's the landscaping money, Margaret?" Silence fell. Margaret's face tightened. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. "The financials don't add up," the man continued. "You charged us thousands for community improvements, but nothing changed. Where did the money go?" Margaret shifted, her hands gripping the table. All expenses were approved by the board and properly allocated. Jake, who had been standing near the back, spoke up. He had come prepared, bringing copies of the financial discrepancies we'd found. He held them up as he stepped forward. "Then explain this," he said. "Greenway Estates Landscaping. A company that doesn't exist. Payments made to a ghost vendor." Murmurs spread through the room. Margaret's composure cracked. "Those transactions were handled by our previous accountant," she snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. "If there was an error, it was purely administrative." Another board member shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret, you told us those payments were legitimate." She shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The cracks in her defenses were widening. That was when the final nail in the coffin arrived. A woman at the back of the room rose from her seat. She was dressed professionally, her expression unreadable. She reached into her bag and produced a folder. "My name is Angela Carter," she said. "I'm with the state auditor's office. We've been conducting an independent review of the HOA's financials, and based on our preliminary findings, there are significant inconsistencies that warrant further investigation." Margaret's face drained of color. Angela continued, "Additionally, we have reason to believe that fraudulent transactions were deliberately concealed. As a result, legal proceedings may be forthcoming." The room was dead silent. Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the crowd. The years of oppressive rules, arbitrary fines, and financial manipulation had finally caught up with her. As the meeting ended, Margaret remained seated, staring blankly ahead. The HOA board members shuffled away, each looking as though they wanted nothing more than to disappear. By the next morning, Margaret resigned. An emergency election was scheduled, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood had a chance to choose leadership that actually represented them. As I walked past Margaret's house later that evening, I noticed the lights were off. Her car was gone. The queen of the HOA had fallen. Justice had finally been served. Margaret's reign ended with a whimper, not a bang. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, she was nowhere to be seen. Her house, once the epicenter of her self-appointed rule, had its blinds drawn and its driveway empty. No one had seen her in days. The emergency election was held in the clubhouse, and for the first time in years, people actually showed up excited, hopeful. The HOA board had been gutted, with most of Margaret's loyalists resigning in rapid succession as the investigation deepened. Only Greg, the so-called treasurer, remained, though he spent most of the meeting avoiding eye contact and looking like he was waiting for a trapdoor to open beneath him. Jake and I sat near the back, watching as the floor opened up for nominations. It was a stark contrast from previous meetings, where Margaret had controlled the process like a puppet master, ensuring only her handpicked candidates made it onto the board. Now the neighborhood had a say. Names were thrown into the mix, but one stood out: Linda Carter. Linda had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years, long before Margaret had slithered her way into power. She was a retired attorney, sharp as a blade, and the kind of person who actually cared about the community. She was also the same woman Margaret had fined for her trash bins being out too long. When she stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. She laid out her vision clearly: transparency, accountability, and a complete overhaul of the HOA's financial operations. She promised to implement an open book policy where residents could review spending at any time. She also vowed to eliminate the absurd fines Margaret had used as a weapon. By the time the votes were tallied, it wasn't even close. Linda was elected HOA president in a landslide, and the rest of the board consisted of people who actually wanted to fix the mess Margaret had left behind. The first order of business: a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances. The investigation wasn't just a minor inconvenience for Margaret, it was a full-blown disaster. The IRS was already circling, but now the state auditor's office was digging deeper. With Linda at the helm, the HOA turned over every document, every report, and every transaction Margaret had ever approved. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Margaret hadn't just been skimming funds, she had been funneling money into an off-the-books account for years. The landscaping scam was just the tip of the iceberg. There were payments made to phantom vendors, inflated service costs, and even withdrawals that had no paper trail. It all pointed to one thing: fraud. The fallout was swift. Margaret had tried to disappear, but you don't just walk away from financial crimes. When the authorities finally caught up with her, she was forced to answer for every dollar she had stolen. The neighborhood erupted in celebration the day the news broke that she had been formally charged. But the real victory wasn't just Margaret's downfall, it was what came after. With Linda leading the charge, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. The arbitrary rules were scrapped. The ridiculous fines were eliminated. For the first time in years, the community actually felt like a place people wanted to live, not a private kingdom ruled by an iron fist. And the best part: the 20% fee increase that Margaret had tried to ram through vanished overnight. Once the finances were properly handled, it turned out the HOA had more than enough money in reserves. The neighborhood had won. Jake and I stood on my porch a few weeks later, watching as a group of kids rode their bikes down the street, something Margaret would have undoubtedly found a reason to complain about. Jake glanced over at me, grinning. "Think she saw this coming?" I shook my head. "She thought she was untouchable. But no one's untouchable when they mess with the wrong people." I couldn't have said it better myself. With Margaret gone and Linda running the HOA, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The toxic air of paranoia and hostility that had lingered for years slowly began to lift. People spoke freely at community events, instead of whispering complaints behind closed doors. The ridiculous fines disappeared, and the neighborhood felt like a place where homeowners actually had a say in how things were run. But there was still unfinished business. One of the biggest issues left in Margaret's wake was the HOA's financial recovery. Sure, the audits had exposed her fraud, and the authorities were handling the legal side, but the money she had siphoned off was still missing. Some of it had been tracked down to hidden accounts, and the IRS was working to claw it back, but the neighborhood had been bled dry for years. The reserves were lower than they should have been, and homeowners wanted to know what could be done to fix it. Linda wasn't the type to sit back and let things work themselves out. At the next HOA meeting, one that actually had full attendance for once, she laid out a plan. She had already consulted with legal experts and financial advisors, and they had determined that the HOA had grounds for a civil lawsuit against Margaret. If successful, they could potentially recover a significant portion of the lost funds. But it wouldn't be easy, and some homeowners were skeptical. People wanted to know how long it would take, how much it would cost in legal fees, and if it was even worth the hassle. After all, Margaret was already facing criminal charges. Wasn't that enough? But Linda had come prepared. She explained that going after Margaret's personal assets wasn't just about getting back what she stole, it was about sending a message. The HOA had been used as a personal piggy bank for too long, and if they didn't fight for restitution, it would set a dangerous precedent. The vote wasn't even close. The lawsuit was approved, and within a week, legal action was officially filed against Margaret. Meanwhile, as the case worked its way through the system, the neighborhood had to find a way to rebuild. Linda had made it clear that she wasn't going to raise fees unless absolutely necessary, but with the missing funds, they had to get creative. Some residents suggested fundraising events, while others proposed cutting unnecessary expenses that Margaret had pushed through, like the absurdly expensive landscaping contracts that had been riddled with fraud. Linda agreed, and as they began renegotiating contracts, it became clear just how much Margaret had inflated costs. One example was the security company Margaret had hired to patrol the neighborhood. It turned out they were charging nearly triple the industry standard. Linda wasted no time canceling that contract and hiring a reputable company at a fraction of the cost. Another major change involved the community clubhouse. Under Margaret's rule, it had been practically off-limits to regular homeowners, only used for HOA meetings and the occasional event she deemed worthy. Now, it was open for residents to actually use. People hosted birthday parties, yoga classes, and even a weekend farmers market. It became a true community space instead of Margaret's personal throne room. As the neighborhood began to heal, the lawsuit against Margaret made its way to court. Margaret, now a shadow of the dictator she once was, tried to fight it. She hired a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records, the fake vendor payments, the fraudulent withdrawals, it was all laid out clearly. The HOA's legal team tore through her defense, methodically proving that she had knowingly and deliberately stolen from the community. The judge didn't waste time. Margaret was ordered to pay restitution, and while she had tried to hide assets, the legal team had done their homework. Her accounts were frozen, her property was scrutinized, and in the end, she was forced to sell off assets to make the payments. It wasn't enough to fully replenish everything she had stolen, but it was a start. With the lawsuit concluded and Margaret officially bankrupt, the neighborhood could finally move forward. The remaining funds were used to restore the HOA's reserves, and Linda ensured that every dollar was accounted for. She even implemented a system where homeowners could view financial reports online, something Margaret would have never allowed. The transformation was undeniable. Homeowners who had once dreaded HOA meetings now actually participated. People who had stayed quiet out of fear of retaliation were now voicing their opinions. The power that had been so tightly controlled by one corrupt woman was now back where it belonged, with the residents. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I noticed something that had been missing for years: laughter. Kids played freely in their yards, neighbors chatted on porches, and the oppressive feeling that had once loomed over the community was gone. Jake joined me as I stood near the clubhouse, watching a group of residents set up for a community barbecue. He shook his head with a grin. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "Me neither," I admitted. Margaret had tried to rule with an iron fist, thinking she was untouchable. But in the end, she had been brought down by the very people she had tried to control. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free. With Margaret's downfall complete and the HOA back in the hands of the community, life in the neighborhood changed in ways I hadn't even realized were possible. The first thing that stood out was the sheer relief in the air. It was like a weight had been lifted. People actually smiled more. Kids played outside without worrying that some arbitrary rule would get their parents fined. And for the first time in years, neighbors weren't afraid to speak their minds. But there was still unfinished business. Linda, true to her word, had begun implementing reforms that would ensure no one could ever use the HOA as a personal cash machine again. One of the biggest changes was a full restructuring of the bylaws. The old rules had been written in a way that gave the board unchecked power, allowing them to raise fees, issue fines, and approve expenses without any real oversight. That was over. A committee of homeowners' regular people, not just board members, was formed to review every policy line by line. The new rules required full transparency in financial decisions, an annual public audit, and a cap on how much fees could be increased without a community-wide vote. With the legal battles over and the HOA stabilized, it was time for the final reckoning, Margaret's old house. No one had seen her since the court ruling. She had been forced to sell her home to cover some of the restitution, and it had sat empty for weeks. The for sale sign in the yard was a painful reminder of the years we had suffered under her rule, but when it finally came down, a crowd gathered to see who the new owners would be. A young couple pulled up in a moving truck, looking eager but slightly wary at the attention. When they introduced themselves, it was clear they had no idea about the history of the house. They had gotten a great deal on the property and were excited to start fresh. The neighborhood welcomed them warmly. There was something poetic about it. Margaret had used that house as her throne. But now it belonged to people who just wanted to be part of a community, not rule over it. As life moved forward, small reminders of Margaret's reign still popped up. The neighborhood's financial recovery was slow but steady, and people occasionally joked about how absurd the old rules had been. But the most satisfying moment came in the form of a letter Linder received a few months after Margaret's departure. It was from the IRS. They had completed their investigation and found even more discrepancies than we had initially uncovered. Margaret had been playing fast and loose with her personal and HOA-related finances for years, and the penalties were severe. She owed back taxes, fines, and legal fees that would likely keep her in financial ruin for the foreseeable future. It was justice, plain and simple. Jake and I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset as we reflected on everything that had happened. It was hard to believe how much the neighborhood had changed, how much power one person had held over us, and how quickly it had all unraveled when people stood up and fought back. Margaret had thought she was untouchable. She had been wrong.